Okay, I still see people coming online, but then we'll let more people join as we go. Welcome again to everybody who's on the call today for session 3 of our California IT Joint Section Technical Series focused on California Senate Bill 743. Today's session is going to be focused on Caltrans perspectives, the third of a 4-part series. And before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to make a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. Many of you have been in the previous calls, should already be aware. We have, you kind of get access to 2 types of boxes. One is a chat box and a Q&A box if you're using Zoom, when you're familiar with Zoom. So the questions for the panelists should be posted in the Q&A box. And we have Cameron Shu from Western IT helping us out with as a gatekeeper for the questions and so forth. So Cameron and I will be monitoring these questions and passing them on to the moderator for them to be directed to the panelists. And we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock today. So we have about 57 minutes for this presentation here today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Bruce so that we can carry on with today's business. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ravi. I'm Bruce Griesenbeck, and I'm the Data and Analysis Manager at the Sacramento Area Council of Government, so an MPO perspective here as a moderator. We're really fortunate today to have with us 4 people who've been really involved in developing the guidance for implementation of SB743 as it applies to transportation projects for Caltrans and Caltrans projects. The guidance came out most recently as the terms are the TAC and the TAF, the Transportation Analysis Framework, and the Transportation Analysis. I can't remember what the C is, but one of the panelists definitely knows that answer that question. When I can tell you as an MPO person, and actually I should probably, one of my functions as a moderator here was to give time for Cameron to do a poll. We're going to run this panel just a little bit differently than we have prior panels. The assumption was that probably a bunch of you have attended one of the TAC or the TAF webinars and gotten the PowerPoint presentations on, and that the best use of the time that we had today was really about trying to get opportunity to ask questions and hear answers from the folks assembled here on the panel from Caltrans to those questions. So we're starting off with a poll, and hopefully it's popped up on your Zoom window as a poll window with a question. Have you attended? Did you attend or watch the Caltrans TAC or TAF webinars? Simple yes and no, and we're going to do that while I'm kind of killing a little bit of time introducing what the panel is going to be about. But when that TAC and TAF guidance came out earlier this year, that was a reminder because a lot of the member agencies that I deal with on SB 743 were really concerned about SB 743 to land development projects, and the TAC and the TAF guidance was a really reminder that there's a whole other area of SB 743 as it applies to transportation projects. And Caltrans is really one of the lead agencies that's obviously very concerned about how that is going to apply to transportation projects for their facilities. And we've got a great panel here, and I'm going to introduce Ellen Greenberg, who's the Chief of Sustainability at Caltrans, and it's been her leadership that really has led to navigating how this is going to work for Caltrans in terms of implementing SB 743 and publishing the TAC and the TAF, as well as all the public outreach, which I can tell you from the standpoint of an MPO, it's been really great to have chances to hear from Caltrans as this is happening and have a chance to provide input as it's happening too. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, and she's going to kick off the brief presentations and the start of the Q&A.
Okay. Thanks so much, Bruce. I'm just going to make sure I'm not muted, and I see I am not muted, so that's a good start. Hey, everybody, thank you for joining. Thanks in particular to Ravi, Cameron, and Bruce for helping us along, and to Randy McCourt for extending an invitation to us. So the process for Caltrans of putting implementation guidance for 743 into place has been a multi-year process. And our thought for today's session was to really devote the time, after some very brief opening remarks, to devote the time to discussion with you. We have our PowerPoint slides at the ready, and we'll pull up slides as needed to answer your questions. We did anticipate a pretty high level of familiarity with the basics. So I see we're kind of just close to half and half on folks who participated in the webinar. That's really helpful to see. And there have been numerous other ways to learn about our implementation. So let's go forward, and I'll describe some of the key, just the basic framework for implementation. So folks who have not had a chance to familiarize themselves will have an appreciation as we get into the Q&A. So the passage of 743 in 2013 led to, and the subsequent adoption of the revisions to the CEQA guidelines in December 2018 are influencing two areas of Caltrans activity. And Bruce already touched on this. So on one side, we have the department's participation as a, really as a stakeholder, as a responsible agency from the CEQA perspective in local agencies' review of land development projects. And our participation happens through our local development and intergovernmental review program, LDIGR, and our related procedures in terms of 743 implementation are through the document known as the TISG, or Transportation Impact Study Guide, and interim guidelines for safety analysis. And Elisa Begley, who is on the line with us today and part of our team, as well as Michael Navarro from Caltrans District 6 in Fresno, they're on the call today specifically to focus on that side of our 743 implementation activities. So that's the set of activities that relates, again, to review of land development proposals. The other side of the 743 program relates to CEQA review of proposals for transportation projects on the state highway system. And the two documents that Bruce referenced, the TAF and the TAC, Transportation Analysis Framework and Transportation Analysis under CEQA, those documents address how we are going to be implementing SB743 as we do CEQA review for transportation projects. And Zongren Wang and myself have been involved in the development of these documents. And the webinars that we're asking about, the most recent webinars are specific to introducing TAP and TAC. There was an earlier webinar on TISG. We will be posting the link to the Caltrans website where webinar recordings and other materials are available, so you can go back if you don't get enough today and follow up on that material. So, what's the big picture here? The big picture is that SB 743 and the way that we are implementing it, the aim is to address a number of state policy objectives. The first is to really evaluate transportation impacts of land development and transportation projects in a way that reflects what I would think of as kind of a comprehensive perspective on transportation impacts and development impacts on transportation. And that's a perspective that looks more holistically, moving away from an approach that focuses on evaluating delay as a transportation impact. The aim of that change relates to our commitments to meeting state climate targets, our commitments to making a difference in the housing crisis by streamlining housing development in infill locations in small and large communities, and in advancing public health broadly across the state. The implications of these changes are really significant. So these are substantial procedural changes that are going to affect our outcomes and our choices going forward. So the 743 implementation approach really does reflect a big change, and that change is more than just CEQA, and it's more than just the guidance documents. And I want everyone on the call to understand that that larger set of changes has the full support of CalSTA Secretary David Kim and Caltrans Director Toks Omoshakin. And in fact, if you look at the TAF and TAC documents, you'll see there's a letter from the director at the front of those documents, and his engagement in these issues is very genuine. Some of you may also be aware that there have been some very substantial changes in the department's executive team over the past 12 to 18 months, and the new executive team is working very well together on this. It really is, I think, a leadership team that is closely aligned and working together. So that's something I think our partners will appreciate, and I certainly appreciate it in terms of my own responsibilities. I want to mention also, a lot of you are probably aware about Governor Newsom's executive order from last year, N1919, and that CalSTA is working now on an implementation plan. And that executive order, though it followed SB743 by quite a number of years, is very much establishing a broader framework in which implementation sits. So the policy direction here is not just Caltrans, it's really a state administration policy direction that is focused on trying to move the state towards a place where people don't need to drive as much, where people can make the choices that they need to make to live their lives, to run their businesses, do their jobs, take care of their families without such dependence on driving. That said, I do want to note an important kind of qualifier when we talk about the TAF and TAC. We are talking about procedures that are expressly for CEQA analysis of projects on the state highway system. The transportation investments on local streets and roads may be evaluated differently, and that's at the discretion of those agency decision makers. I'll also note that while I'm talking about a big change, there are also a lot of things that aren't changing. So these changes don't affect our maintenance program. They don't affect paving, safety projects. They don't affect ped, bike, or transit projects. So there are lots of projects that are going to go forward as before and that aren't impacted. The projects that will be evaluated based on the 743 guidance are the capacity increasing projects on the state highway system. So it is, from a numerical point of view, it's a small percentage of total projects, but these are projects that are very consequential. They are the projects that are the big budget projects generally. So we recognize that there are we have many partners and stakeholders for which these are, really important projects, and these are changes that, of course, are of concern. Because the TAF and TAC are bringing in a big change, we have recognized a phase-in period, and some of you that have been involved in the process will know that we've had what we've called a concurrence process ongoing during the preparation of the documents, particularly from the beginning of 2019 through September 15th of this year. We have been examining projects individually to assess whether they require VMT analysis. And those projects were examined before our guidance was published. So you will see some projects proceeding without using the process that is described in the TAF and TAC. And that's because those projects were at a point, they were pipeline projects that had already proceeded to a point where we felt that their interim status really warranted continuing along the project delivery process. Next, I just want to note again, that many of you on the line have been part of our earlier conversations. Bruce was referencing the extensive stakeholder process that's been ongoing. So thanks to the many of you that have been involved. You've heard me talk about the process before, and I just want to reiterate again that the documents and the process we'll be talking about are very much products of an effort among administration partners. We've worked very closely with the Air Resources Board and OPR, as well as with stakeholders. So the perspective is not solely a Caltrans perspective. And I want to say also, we know these materials are not perfect and that there's more work to be done. And that work will be done continuing to work with our administration partners and with you and your organizations as our partners. Some of that work is quite technical. We're particularly aware of the need to further develop guidance around priced facilities. There's an enormous amount of mitigation, interest in the question of mitigation that we're working on, refining some of our tools. And we are sponsoring grants and research on these topics, looking forward to your further contributions. With that, again, I do think the best use of our time together is in discussion, and our PowerPoints are at the ready as needed. I just want to introduce my colleagues who are here today and thank them for their dedication to this work. And I can, Bruce's suggestion, I agree that it would be helpful if each of them describe their participation in the 743 program and their roles currently. So the three other Caltrans folks who are going to be in the discussion today are Zhongwen Wang from the Headquarters Division of Traffic Operations, Elisa Begley from Headquarters Division of Transportation Planning, and Michael Navarro. Michael is the Deputy District Director for Planning in Caltrans District 6, headquartered in Fresno. So Zhongwen, maybe you can just introduce yourself and describe your role, and then hand it over to Elisa and then Michael.
Hi, Ellen. Yeah, this is Zhongwen. In fact, you hear me okay, right? Too loud? Okay. So I have been, very fortunate to have the opportunity working for Ellen, to support her in developing the TAF. Pretty much will be the transportation analysis framework and the CEQA. And on the technical side, a lot of the discussion on the NCST and TDM, that will be addressed to me. So thank you and have the opportunity. So Lisa.
Hi there, I'm Elisa Begley. Like Ellen said, out of Transportation Planning and Caltrans. I was the lead for the development of our guidance for Caltrans review of land use projects, which is called the VMT Focused Transportation Impact Study Guide. That evolved how Caltrans reviews local land use projects and plans for their potential impact on the state highway system. And there is an accompanying document for safety analysis that our safety team at Caltrans led, but it is used by the LDIGR program. And that's our interim guidance for safety analysis. So looking forward to hearing seeing your questions in the chat regarding our land use review. Now on to Michael.
Good afternoon, Michael Navarro, Deputy District Director here in District 6 in Fresno. So pretty much under my purview, like Ellen explained earlier, is that a lot of focus is on the land use side of the house, the local development IGR. So working with these guidance documents and working with our respective team and our local partners on how to implement 743 from a local land use perspective. But however, also wearing a separate hat as the Deputy District Director of Planning, I'm also involved in the early onset of Caltrans transportation projects. So therefore, also vested in the TAP and TAC guidance as well as we look at our transportation projects and scope those and work with our local partners on how we move forward on some of those projects. So thank you.
And I'm going to just cut in real briefly as moderator here. We're not seeing a lot of questions coming in on the question and answer, and just a reminder: the questions should go into that Q&A portion, not the chat. We'll sort of shepherd the questions in from the chat if they go that way, but it's the Q&A portion that we'd like you to weigh in with questions. I know from prior versions of this that there are questions out there.
Well-
And first one came in from Sherry Ryan. Thank you, Sherry. How can I find out who is the local coordinator for LDGIR review? And
We do have LDIGR coordinators around the state and in each district. So maybe shoot me an email and I can help get you to the right contact person. This is Elisa.
Yeah.
And I know that Ravi has a slide for the end with the email addresses for all of us. Also, I'm going to follow up on Zongren's introduction just to chase some of those acronyms down for folks who aren't so familiar, because otherwise it can get pretty bewildering. So Zongren referenced his work with the two primary tools that are referenced in the transportation analysis framework. And these are travel demand models, which most or all of you will be familiar with. And so we use the acronym TDM, always aware that that is, of course, confusing also with the folks who use TDM to refer to travel demand management. So in this case, travel demand models. And then he also referred to the NCST. NCST is the National Center for Sustainable Transportation at UC Davis, and they have developed a tool for estimating induced travel. And induced travel is the focus of analysis, of the CEQA analysis of transportation impacts, and that's described in our TAF document. And induced travel is the phenomenon that occurs when there's a behavioral response to increases in system capacity, and people drive more. Additional driving is stimulated by changes in the system. So the NCST is an induced travel calculator, and travel demand models are also one of the key tools in preparing projections of anticipated impact of proposed projects.
And,
so that's your acronyms.
And we are seeing some questions come on induced demand. Ellen, my understanding is the real definition of a VMT impact for a transportation project is really the estimate of induced demand. Is that a correct understanding of the framework document and the CEQA document?
Yes, it is. Zongren, you want to add anything on that?
No, I think, yeah, Bruce got it right. I think, yes, that's what we're talking about, the induced travel. We use the word induced travel instead of induced demand all the time.
And I'll note, for those people that are familiar with OPR's technical advisory on implementing SB743 and the guidance and the CEQA guidelines, you'll see the phrase traffic attributable to the project. And that language, I think, was specifically selected to differentiate travel that's associated with population and economic growth from travel that is really in response to a capacity addition.
Great, and I see one question from somebody who, they're part of the half of the audience that didn't attend one of the prior webinars. Is there a shorthand way of describing what the TAC and the TAF documents actually do? You started with a real brief orientation of that. If you can add to that, that would be appreciated by at least.
Yeah, in fact, I can share our flow chart if I can. Can I screen share, Ravi?
Yes, Ellen, you can.
Okay. We're going to see how this goes. Oh, looks very promising.
Yep, got it.
Okay. So this flowchart is included in both of the documents, and it's illustrating the content and the relationship between the two documents, the TAC and the TAF. So what you're seeing here is an outline of what is contained in the TAC and also the process that it describes. And I think the really helpful thing is that this is a standard CEQA process. So it's identifying the key steps in the CEQA process in reference to the transportation analysis. So there's a project scoping, as with any CEQA document. And then the screening step is really unique here. So in the screening step for transportation impacts, the key question is whether the project is of a type that is likely to induce travel. So this is where there's that distinction between capacity increasing projects, such as the addition of new lane miles versus, say, a repaving project. So if you had a paving project, you would say, no, not likely to induce travel, and that would simply be documented in a brief narrative. But if the project is identified as a capacity adding project and there's a yes answer, that's when you would refer to the TAF. So this yes branch says, okay, we're looking at the TAF because the TAF provides the guidance on actually analyzing the impact of that project on VMT. And then the output from the TAF feeds into the process of findings of significance under CEQA. And then when the finding is made, if a significant impact is found, there is then a need to identify mitigation and assess whether VMT impacts have been fully mitigated. So the TAC document covers those standard steps of the CEQA process. The TAF document is specifically focused on the method of analysis of VMT impact. How did I do, Bruce?
Great, great. And I'm going to build on that question
Yeah.
with another question that came in. And this, you mentioned that managed lanes and price lanes in particular were an area that more work is needed. The question came in from Dave Tokarski. Can you talk more about HOV lanes and managed lanes as capacity increases versus non-capacity increasing improvements? And I think some of the gist of that question really is about which of those types of projects are exempt versus which of those really are subject to VMT analysis.
Okay, and maybe I will lob that over to Zongren so I don't dominate the whole call. Zongren, you want to take that one?
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen, on that. And then, yes, we do have, if your folks read through the OPR, that's the Office of Governor's Office of Planning and Research, they do have a list of projects that will be screened out. We don't call it exempt. We call it screened out. Project types out there, I think about 20 of those. That's on their page 20 to 21, on their OPR guidance. Right, so they do have a list of all those projects. And when you talk about, the non-capacity adding type of projects, right? And Alan also just now mentioned, we do have some of our safety projects, some are, pattern bike and transit type of projects also will be screened out, right? So, however, when the question I think from David is asking for the managed lane or HOV lane type of a capacity adding type of projects, that will not be screened out because of the travel inducing capability, from such projects. And in our guidance, Alan also briefly alluded to that we don't really have a, say like the elasticity method, to calculate the induced travel, out of those type of price the facility, but we are in the effort, we're trying to develop that type of tools in the moment. Thank you. Any responses from David, or you can send me another comment? Okay, so or definitely you have my email later on. You can always catch up with me. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm trying to sift through and find ways to cover more than one question with this. So you mentioned the NCST elasticity-based calculator and a TDM, and those are both mentioned as models that should, for a project that's not screened out, those are methods that should be used to estimate induced VMT, the VMT impact for a project. We had one question on what happens if you're in an area that doesn't really have a workable travel demand model. And then a question that I think is on a lot of people's mind is CEQA barely likes one number for impact assessment, and here we have two numbers. There's not a real clear path to kind of resolving what you do with two numbers in a CEQA process, and is there what's likely to happen in terms of next steps, either with additional guidance or in terms of just resolving that issue of like, what do you do with the two numbers on induced demand?
So I'm gonna, how about if I start, because I think there's a general point. So we recognize that different parts of the state have, varying resources and tools at the ready. And one thing that I want folks to be aware of is that the guidelines very specifically state that if there is not a model available to enable a quantitative analysis, that a qualitative analysis will be acceptable. And the guidance does reflect that. So I see Zongren is sharing his screen now, so I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen, on that. In fact, I do see Nelson asking for a little description, on how the guideline has been, in terms of recommending a assessment method, right? So I think in our first release of the TAF document, I think you folks probably already seen, this general matrix. That's how we recommend your folks, to select a assessment method. And definitely, notice the word, the preferred assessment method. That's in our current release of the TAF document. Okay, so in this matrix, we're talking about, the assessment methods are associated, with the project type and also with project location. Okay, so when you talk about the project type, we're talking about, capacity adding type of project. Everything I show here, will be capacity adding type of project. Okay, so if it is screened out, that belongs to a different category. Okay, so when a project is a capacity adding type of project, we will see the number one thing is we will see the project type. Will it be a general purpose lane and an HV lane addition? If it is, that means the NCST tool or NCST calculator is applicable. Okay, so you fall into this blue zone, basically. You have this blue zone there. In that time, you do have both the NCST tool and also the travel demand model be applicable. Okay, and we do have another slide to show you the detailed selection method. How you can, select only one method, or how you can explain or reconcile. I hate to use that word, but how you can explain or integrate those two numbers out there, like Bruce just now brought up. Okay, so that's when the NCST and the travel demand model both are applicable. And a lot of times, the NCST tool is not applicable. At that time, probably the only method you may have will be the travel demand models. And at that time, in the golden matrices out here, in the golden color field, cells there, most of the time you will use travel demand model. However, if you don't have a travel demand model, we also open for other quantitative methods before you will use any qualitative methods out there. Okay, so I mean, this is one slide. Again, this is a general selection of the preferred assessment methods, based on the project type and the project location. All right, and the next slide will show you, after you have a general decision from this table 1. You see that this is the table 1 in the current release of the TAF document, and a general decision will be, suppose if you the major branch will be, is the NCST calculator applicable or not, right? So if it is applicable, that means sometimes you might have both NCST tool and also the travel demand model to choose from, right? So, and let's just follow this branch at this time. If NCST tool is available, and if the TDM or travel demand model is not there, definitely you will use only the NCST calculator, right? And when you have the travel demand model available, however, if your travel demand model did not pass the 5 checks we talk about, at this time, you will use NCST calculator exclusively, and or you can adjust your travel demand model's input and output. Basically, you do your pre or post processing, and you disclose your model deficiency before use. So that's the recommendation. That's another situation. Okay, so when you have the travel demand model, and your travel demand model will pass all 5 checks we listed out in the current TAF document. At this time, the key is that we will compare the 2 numbers out there. If your NCST number will be used as a benchmark, okay? If your travel demand model number is close within 20% of that of the NCST number, then we'll say, okay, at this time, you can use your travel demand model. Okay, well, if the travel demand model number is more than 20% larger or smaller than the NCST estimate, at that time, you will use NCST calculator exclusively, or you can use a TDM and explain why the 20% number is out there, why such a big difference occurs. Okay, so that's the major, detailed guidance,
Great.
How you select your models and tools. I'll stop right here.
That's great. And I do think the person who started this whole question was asking if the no TDM is available. And I think it's clear that other qualitative methods are available, are acceptable to use for that. So we have one question that is getting a lot of interest, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's from Eric Ruhr. It's addressed to Ellen, although I think others would weigh in on it, and I'm going to add a supplemental once we're done with this one, because I think there's a mirror question that comes from this one too. If a transportation project led by a local agency requires a Caltrans encroachment permit, will Caltrans require the use of Caltrans VMT analysis methodology, or can the lead agency use its own method?
That is a great question. So I think that in most cases, the answer is going to be that a VMT analysis won't be required, but I think there may be some exceptional cases. There are also maybe some cases where there's a related project on the state highway system, for example, ramp capacity addition that might, so one example I've seen is a project that involved an arterial widening on a locally owned arterial, but that was connected then to an interchange improvement separately. They might not have required VMT analysis, or that interchange, if it was just the interchange project, it might have not been assessed as having the potential to generate induced travel, but taking into account that there's this arterial project as well, maybe together, those really do require VMT analysis. I think this is going to be a matter of conversation between Caltrans teams and the locals, but I think there will be many projects that will not be required to have VMT analysis. But Michael may have a perspective on this, or Zongren?
Yeah, I could chime in real quick. I think that's a great example. And the easy answer for something like this is always, as we figure this out, it depends, I guess, is a simple answer. But I mean, in the district that I work in, obviously you have self-help counties and measure projects that have projects that may overlap in the state highway system. And I think this stresses the importance of the documentation, the communication you have with your local partners, and keeping us engaged and having these conversations often and early as we scope these out and look at the opportunity and going back to guidance. And here in our district, we do use, Ellen and Zongren as a reference and guidance. So oftentimes I have these very same questions when a local partner asks me, and I think I might know the answer, but I know it's always safe to run back and put our heads together and have those conversations and bring our partners in to discuss. So.
Yeah, and thanks. I appreciate the both answers. And it sounds like the main answer is consult early with the district staff and pose the question to them. But it sounds like there's a little bit of case by case on this until we actually do some learning from how this applies.
I think there's definitely case by case, and I think we're also really going to be interested in seeing the perspectives of our partners, their consultants, et cetera. Like, this is new to all of us, So,
Yeah.
careful thinking by the folks who are involved on the local agency side and on behalf of the local agencies is really going to help us. So, we're going to be working together with folks on this.
I had a flip side question on that. So for a local agency land development project that has some level of impact on a state highway, what standards is Caltrans going to be applying to evaluating that impact? Are they going to look at the local agency review of the VMT generation of the land generation project, or are they going to limit themselves purely to the VMT impact on the state highway system?
Okay, I'm gonna ask Elisa, I'm gonna ask you to answer, but I just want to first make sure that we recognize that there are areas and communities all around the state that are identified as low VMT areas where this analysis isn't necessary. And then I'm gonna hand it over to Elisa, who can comment on that and also talk about what happens when it is necessary.
Yeah. For the Caltrans review of land use projects, we focus on the VMT of that land use project and the methodologies and calculation of that project VMT. And also we take a look at how the project is mitigating any VMT impacts with deference to what Ellen was just saying. The program at Caltrans that reviews local development projects is watching with great interest as screening maps are developed or qualitative descriptions of what low VMT areas are for a particular jurisdiction. So we focus on the project's VMT. We do not try and calculate, that project VMT impact on the state highway system.
Cool. We've got another question that's getting a lot of interest, and hopefully this is a softball. I assume it is. Does Caltrans still require HCM-based freeway mainline ramp and junction and LOS analysis at ramp arterial intersections for land use projects contributing greater than 100 peak hour trips to a freeway? And it's a similar question to the one that I think Elisa just fielded, but it's a little bit more pointed.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a worthwhile thing to answer. There's a lot of interest in it.
So I could jump in if that's okay and just talk about from a District 6 perspective. So there's been a huge cultural change in how we look at projects in this new VMT environment. So when we start looking at projects, we are focused on the VMT, and I think the review has kind of changed where we initially were focused our review on the impacts of the car, and now we're looking more at bikes and peds, obviously. I do work with some jurisdictions that actually have retained level of service guidance from a local agency perspective, and typically they've done that to kind of disincentivize what you consider a sprawl project. So there are some locations where actually the local agencies are still requiring level of service analysis, but you will not see a level of service comment coming from us in the district. Now that the citing of the 100 trips and the level service, that sounds like a reference from our traffic study guidelines from 2001 or 2002. But you won't see that standard. The VMT 743 interim guide, or not interim guidance, I apologize. The TISG guidance we have now will not have a reference to a threshold of 100 trips and a level of service analysis.
And I'm going to translate that into a short answer. The short answer is Caltrans is not going to be requiring that analysis. And if somebody does that analysis, it is not being required by Caltrans. Is that correct? Okay.
That's correct. Now we do look at projects at the ramps from, I think Alicia talked earlier about the safety guidance. So we do look at, queuing on ramps and potential for backup on the freeway. So we do look at those kind of operational analysis from a safety perspective, but not just for the sole purposes of improving level of service.
And then we have a question coming in from Ron Milam. It's a long question. I'm just going to ask Ellen and the rest of the panel to read it and go around the horn basically to respond. Mm-hmm. It really has to do with the guidance essentially says that transportation projects are evaluated on a different metric of VMT than land development projects per the OPR guidance. It's as much an OPR question, I think, as a Caltrans question, but it's worth hearing from you all on. I'm going to
Yeah,
paraphrase
I mean,
a little bit.
I've seen this question before from Ron, but I just have to, I'm going to decline to respond because I don't have a fast response to it. But I will commit to following up and providing a response, but I don't have one off the top of my head. I understand Ron isn't the only one who has questions about the way, land use versus transportation and the interaction, both the issue of consistency and the issue of the interaction between the two. And I respect, that area of inquiry because we are talking about, environments, right? Physical and economic and social environments that are fully integrated. People, the idea of teasing apart transportation impacts versus land use impacts has a level of artificiality to it. And, I recognize that. And for the purpose of analysis, though, these things are teased out separately. But I don't have an immediate response. And if anyone else from the team does, I can certainly comment. Okay, Ron, we owe you one.
I'm interested in that same comment too, and I'm going to tie it to a question and give you guys a little bit of a breather. One question came in from David Tokarski addressed to me. Can you discuss how MPOs such as SACOG are dealing with potential land use changes associated with induced demand? I think we commented fairly heavily on the TAC and the TAF document, and it was our comments on, and it was comments also made some of our member agencies. And the gist of the comments was related to does the land use context of a transportation project make a difference about the VMT inducing effects that transportation project could have? Our assertion in our comments was that it does and it should. There's a recognition, I think, and that we were not the only one who made that comment for sure. There's recognition in the TAC and the TAF, the current draft of it, the version 1.0, I'm going to call it, recognizing the fact that this is somewhat of a living document at the moment. And I do want to ask a pointed question about how living it is, and is there a schedule moving forward for when it's going to be updated. But yeah, we were looking for some way of connecting the evaluation of the transportation project based on where it is in the region and what type of growth that project is intended to serve. And it's a way of potentially getting to one metric on VMT. That said, it's complicated and it would have to be worked through over time. And CEQA is not a great mechanism for exploratory work in my experience. So I hope we haven't forgotten that. And it seemed like there's an opening in the TAC and the TAF guidance to come back and try and look at how do you actually connect the context of a transportation project with the VMT impact it has. We haven't given up on that one for sure. Hopefully that answer is appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Bruce, you're characterizing it really pretty well. I mean, there is, in the documentation, there's really a series of opportunities for the specific context of the project to influence the outcome and to even diverge from the results that are suggested through the use of these tools. Partly in recognition of the diversity of environments, partly in recognition of the early stage of, this whole approach. So, both figure in there. And I will say that one of the specific circumstances that folks have pointed to often, we've had a lot of conversations about rural environments. And in the slide that Zongman pulled up, there's particular attention to the rural counties, 21 counties that are outside of MPO areas. So we've, in some cases, addressed separately rural counties. And then there's also been attention to the issue of what are characterized as rural areas within MPOs. And I will say there's some difference of opinions there. And, we've kind of landed on the place that rural areas within MPOs are economically tied to the employment opportunities in those areas. And so the transportation impacts, we think, can be encompassed in a unified way, including those rural areas. But there is flexibility for analysts to, describe the context and a justification for a different output. We're going to, again, like you're saying, anticipate, we're going to see how it goes. And in terms of updating the guidance, there's not a schedule. Also, we need to see what happens. And I think we'll probably produce some supplemental guidance maybe before we go back in and produce the next edition and move forward from 1.0. And just to make clear, the documents that are out now are not draft documents. They are the first edition of the documents we'll be implementing.
Version 1.0, got it. We're coming down to the last few minutes here, and I think we have the time for maybe one or two more. There is a question on tiering, but the tiering question also really has to do with prior environmental documents and projects that are based on prior environmental documents. And I think the gist of the question is if someone is either tiering off of a prior environmental analysis or they're relying on an LOS-based environmental analysis for a project that might be going through an amendment or a change, how does that work with the new guidance?
Yeah, so there is specific language in the TAC document around tiering off RTP-SCS EIRs. And we do think that currently the opportunity is quite limited because the documents were not prepared, with the guidance available. So the way we're looking at it is future EIRs may allow for tiering, if they take induced travel into account adequately, if those plans are consistent with state climate targets, and if there's enforceable mitigation associated with the document. So I would suggest you look at the TAC and that's what's in there. The question, was there also part of that about subsequent documents if projects change?
Yes, like is there a trigger for how big of a change a project might have before it has to reevaluate under new standards, new guidance?
I think that the trigger is really if there is a change that is likely to affect the extent to which induced travel would be generated or not. So, that's the judgment that would have to be made. Just lost your audio, or I just lost your audio?
It looks like
Sorry.
you're muted.
There's a question
muted,
on, and hopefully it's a quick one here, given that we're down to the last couple of minutes. What would mitigation banking, or would mitigation banking or programmatic VMT mitigation be an optional mitigation measure for capacity enhancing projects?
So this is something that we are working on a research scope on the question of mitigation banking right now. So it's something that there's a great deal of interest in, and we are looking into it. So stay tuned is the quick response on that.
That gives us time for one more, hopefully quick response. Have any demand-inducing transportation projects made their way through the Caltrans process yet? And if so, what was the outcome?
Not yet, right? Because the documents just really went into full effect September 15th, so we have not yet seen full use of the new guidance.
Robbie, do you want to? We're down to the last 5 minutes here. Do we want to try and get one more question in?
Maybe one question in. Yeah, one last
I think
question.
we're actually down to the last open question. As far as transportation inducing projects, how does Caltrans view gap closure projects? And I think that what that means is there's 6-lane corridor and there's one segment that's still at 4. That's being widened.
That's the one from Sam. That must be somebody from my district that asked that question, it looks like. So I could give you the short answer from experience. They are viewed as capacity enhancing. In our district, State Route 99 is an important corridor for goods movement and interregional commerce. And we do have a handful of gaps, we'll refer to as gaps, but maybe like 5-6 mile segments that we do in our district have various projects in different stages of project delivery right now, meaning either we've done the project initiation document, in construction, or going through the environmental process. So, so I can assure you those are viewed as capacity enhancing. It just kind of depends on where they're in the process in terms of environmental and in correlation with the TAP and the TAC as far as which process they go through, whether it's concurrence or the ones that haven't even started environmental and we're past that September 15th date, then yes, they would be subject to VMT going forward.
Well, as moderator, I want to thank all the panelists, and we were a slow start on the questions, but it was a fast finish for sure. I'm going to hand it back over to Robbie for any kind of closing housekeeping.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. And yeah, I want to thank all of our panelists and the moderator here today. I'm sure there are some lingering questions or some interest questions that our participants, sorry, our listeners here today want to ask any of our panelists. So you see their email addresses on your screen. So you may want to feel free to email them if you have any specific questions or follow-through items and so forth. And with that, I also, again, I want to thank our panelists and moderator here today for being with us. And I'll also take this opportunity to remind our audience here today about the upcoming final session, fourth of 4 sessions. This would be, the theme would be on decision makers' perspectives, and it's coming up on Thursday, November 5th, which would be next week after Election Day, I want to add. So we encourage people to attend this one as well. This would be more of a political perspectives from the actual decision makers. And City of Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg, who's the original author of SB743, is going to be attending as well. So with that, I want to take this opportunity to thank our hosts and coordinators here today. Western ITE, of course, their support, and all of the ITE, California ITE sections that were a part of this, now reaching out to their constituents and getting the word about these events. And of course, ITE NorCal for hosting this event and the support. So without further ado, we will sign off for today, and we'll hope to see you next week. Thank you, and you guys all have a good rest of the week. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you all.
Take care.